When I first arrived in the United States, I was 20 years old and working as an au pair. I had little experience but was eager and extremely nervous. I grew up in a small town in France and had never been away from home, let alone crossed an ocean. My English still needed work, yet I managed well enough to get by. I expected this to be a great year, a new adventure, a cultural exchange, something to later share with my friends back home. When I returned home, I was assigned to the Joseph family. I won't mention the exact town for privacy reasons, but it was an upper-middle-class neighborhood with quiet streets, attractive houses, and spacious backyards, the kind of area where you'd expect well-behaved kids, active PTA moms, and busy, hard-working parents. I remember feeling so relieved when I first arrived, convinced that nothing bad would happen in a place like that. The Josephs had two boys, Brock and Brandon. Brock, the older one at 12, was a typical kid, sometimes lazy and even a bit rude, but ultimately harmless. He made jokes, loved his Xbox, and mostly stayed out of trouble. Brandon, however, was different. He was 9 and already exuded a disturbing coldness that I can't quite describe. I suspect he might have had some sort of social disorder because when I first met him, he simply stared at me without saying a word, not out of shyness or embarrassment, but as if he were studying me. After a few seconds, he smiled and asked, "Are you the maid?" I awkwardly laughed and explained that I was there to help take care of him and his brother for the year. He didn't laugh with me, he just continued watching. It soon became clear that Brandon wasn't like other kids. My host parents had warned me that he was difficult. They mentioned he had a bit of an attitude, but that was the understatement of the century. Brandon didn't just have an attitude, he was downright mean, and not in the ordinary bratty way of teasing his brother or refusing food. It was far worse. He lied about everything. Once he told his teacher that Brock had tried to choke him in the kitchen, which never happened. He even told the neighbor that his parents locked him in a closet at night. He once informed me that the previous au pair had run away because of him and was never seen again. When I attempted to scold him, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't tell me what to do." At that point, everything was still manageable for me, although I admit I was somewhat frightened of him. Things only worsened from there. One night, about 2 months in, I pulled back my sheets and froze. There were thumbtacks scattered all over my mattress. I just stood there for a second, seeing dozens, maybe even 100, of them pointing upward, as if waiting for me to lie down. My heart began racing, the mattress cover had tiny punctures all over. I realized in horror how close I'd come to lying on them. Earlier that day, I'd caught Brandon spying on me as he peeked through a crack in the door while I was folding clothes. I didn't think much of it at the time, simply assuming he was being nosy, but after seeing those thumbtacks, I wasn't so sure. I was honestly terrified and didn't want to tell his parents, fearing they'd send me back to France. So I cleaned up the mess and kept quiet. After that, things grew increasingly strange. Brandon started following me around the house. I'd catch him peeking around corners, watching me from doorways. Sometimes, when I was cooking or reading, I'd look up to find him sitting across the room, staring without blinking. I never said anything. I admit I tried to avoid him as much as possible out of fear. One afternoon, while watering flowers in the garden, I caught a sharp, sour odor, like something rotting. I followed the smell to a corner of the yard where the soil looked freshly disturbed. Curious, I grabbed a small garden shovel and began poking at the soil. When I saw what was there, I nearly screamed. There were 3 dead rabbits buried there, their bodies twisted and slashed in several places. One had its legs tied together with string. I ran inside to tell my host parents. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph looked concerned at first, until they pulled Brandon aside to question him. He gave an innocent look and said it wasn't him. They believed him. Mrs. Joseph claimed it was probably one of the neighborhood kids and sent Brandon back inside. After that, I began sleeping with my bedroom door locked. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow near my bed. It was Brandon. He was standing there holding something. After blinking a few times, I realized it was a kitchen knife. I screamed as loudly as I could. By the time the parents rushed in, the knife was gone. Brandon had shoved it under the bed and convinced them he'd been sleepwalking. Mrs. Joseph gave me an annoyed look, as if to say, "Why are you making such a fuss?" I pointed to the knife handle sticking out from under the bed and pleaded with them to believe me. Mr. Joseph knelt down, pulled it out, and showed it to Brandon. He simply smiled and said he had never seen it before, and they, of course, believed him. I told them that since my door had been locked, he must have picked it up, but they insisted that was nonsense. I felt utterly alone. I didn't know what to do. For better or worse, a decision was made for me. The next morning, Mrs. Joseph called me into the living room and accused me of stealing her jewelry. I was completely confused until she held up a pearl necklace I had never seen before, claiming she'd found it in my purse, which she was clutching in her other hand. I begged her to believe me that I hadn't taken it, but nothing I said could convince her. Brandon stood in the hallway, smiling to himself. I knew it was him. They fired me on the spot. I flew back to France the very next day, unable to believe how easily Brandon had ruined my life. For months afterward, I sank into deep depression, feeling as if I had blown my one chance at living in the US and fearing I'd never get another opportunity. Fortunately, a few years later, I found my way back to America. I now have a good job and great friends. I still think about Brandon from time to time, and I can only imagine the evil person he may have become. For most people, traveling alone is terrifying, and understandably so, but it has never bothered me too much. I've always been independent and outgoing, which is probably why I decided to become an au pair. I've also always wanted to become a child psychologist because I believe many of the world's problems could be solved with better parenting and proper guidance. Additionally, I've always wanted to experience America, so working as an au pair was a serious consideration for me. I'm originally from Germany, from a tiny village outside of Alton, which most Americans have never heard of, so when people ask where I'm from, I usually just say, Germany, to keep it simple. Before you say anything, I believe my English is pretty good, or so I'm told, and it has improved considerably since living in the US. People are often impressed by it. My father is originally from the UK and did everything he could to ensure that my English was as good as, if not better than, my German. I'm not sure if they have electronic dictionaries like I did in the US, but I grew up with one that doubled as a translator. I used it a lot as a kid, plugging in words and translating them with my dad. I also read a great deal when I was younger, which I think really helped me later on. My host family lives in a wealthy suburb in Northern California, and their house is unbelievable. You might think that living here would be lonely, but the agency does a great job connecting nearby au pairs, so I quickly formed a bond with a few girls in the surrounding neighborhoods. My best friend here is an American girl named Jennifer. She's fantastic, similar to me, though a bit louder and taller. We've been inseparable since we met, sharing the same goals, working, exploring, and making the most of our time abroad. There's a huge college campus nearby, which is pretty much the only decent place to go out that isn't a $100 Uber ride away, with both frat and bar scenes available. I think many of the guys are naturally drawn to us because of our accents. Our international flair seems to get us quite far. It's supposedly difficult to get into frat parties without being in a sorority, but we haven't had much trouble with that. The bars here are a lot more fun, though our favorite spot is a bar called Tap. I've noticed that Americans love to theme their nights, Taco Tuesday, Wine Wednesday, or any excuse to drink on a weekday, and I must say, Tuesdays have become the most enjoyable nights for Jennifer and me. This story takes place on one such Tuesday night, a few months after I arrived in the US. I was standing by the bar waiting for drinks for Jennifer and me when a tall guy with curly brown hair approached me and said, "You're German, right?" That completely threw me off. People rarely guess I'm German, even though I'm European. I don't have many stereotypical German features. I laughed and confirmed he was right, and he introduced himself as Sebastian with a confident smile. We talked for a while, and everything felt very natural. I admit I get approached a lot when I go out. I'm in shape and I know I'm decent looking, but most guys tend to be cheesy when they speak to me. Sebastian, however, felt different. The more we talked, the more it seemed he was genuinely interested in me as a person rather than just flirting. He even knew a lot of details about German culture, which I really liked because many Americans I talk to don't know much about the rest of the world. It was refreshing to converse with someone well-traveled, smart, and cultured. After we talked for a while longer, I introduced him to Jennifer. He smiled and called over his friend, an Asian guy who introduced himself as Hunter. Jennifer and Hunter immediately headed off together. Overall, the evening went great. Before the night ended, Sebastian asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. A few days later, Sebastian invited me over for dinner. When I arrived at his place, I expected a restaurant-like setup, but instead, he was cooking a pie for us in his kitchen, which was very sweet. I ended up helping him prepare the meal, and he even opened a bottle of wine for us. I had such a great time that I stayed over at his apartment the next morning. When I woke up, I noticed his room was different from typical college apartments. It was very neat. He didn't have any posters or the usual decorations, but his walls were covered with dozens of square black and white landscape photographs of cities, countryside views, and familiar places. I looked closely and realized that nearly all of them had locations printed on them. They were all from Germany, except for one picture of Monte Carlo, Monaco. By then, Sebastian had already woken up, so I turned and jokingly asked if he had a thing for German architecture. He laughed and told me about his dad's aerial photo collection, explaining that he'd chosen some of his favorite shots from it. I walked back toward his bed and suddenly noticed more pictures above it. My jaw dropped when I saw one of them was a landscape of my own village, taken from above, only about 20 minutes from my home. I told him this, and he got excited, asking me a bunch of questions about my hometown, which I happily answered over the next few weeks. Sebastian and I spent a lot of time together. I worked during the week while he had classes, but we spent every weekend going out together. Plus, Tuesdays were always great. He was a sweet guy who made sure I was comfortable and having fun when we went out, and he was very kind to my friends, which I appreciated. However, his friend Hunter turned out to be a bit odd. Every time someone played "Take It Off" by Fisher, he would literally start stripping in front of Jennifer. One night, Sebastian got extremely drunk as he walked me to his apartment, rambling about how much he adored German women and that he always wanted a German wife. At one point, he even said he'd always dreamed of marrying an au pair because foreign girls were so great with kids. I brushed it off as a strange fantasy, though it was the first thing he said that didn't sit well with me. Not that it was a deal breaker, he'd been perfect until then. Then came the first time he took me out to dinner at an Italian restaurant. He told me he chose the place because they had plenty of vegetarian options, which was sweet, although I had never mentioned being vegetarian. I smiled and playfully asked how he knew, and he replied that he saw it in one of my Instagram posts. That explanation eased me for the rest of the dinner, but later I realized that my only post mentioning vegetarianism was from years ago in Germany, and I post so infrequently that it would have been hard to notice. And that's not even counting that all my posts are from a long time ago. The next time I stayed over, while Sebastian was asleep, I unlocked his phone. He hadn't been careful about hiding his password. What I found was sickening. There was a folder in his camera roll titled "Wife" that contained screenshots of my social media dating posts from months ago, complete with captions, tagged locations, and even old stories I barely remembered posting. His notes app was even worse. It had English translations of my old posts, along with a rough schedule of when and where I'd go out based on my Instagram stories. There was even information about my hometown and my interests, all gathered from my Instagram. But the worst was a photo of my driver's license. Everything hit me at once. The night I lost my wallet at a frat party had exposed my ID, and that's how he'd found my Instagram, learned everything about me, and even my birthday. It wasn't by chance, he had planned all of it. There was a long, graphic message detailing in disgusting detail what he wanted to do to me, a message I don't wish to repeat. I never even found out who the sender was. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore, so I gathered my things and quietly slipped out of his apartment without making a sound. Regrettably, I didn't take any photos as evidence. During the drive back to my host family's house, my hands were shaking. Germans take privacy very seriously. Even though my au pair profile was private, he had my full name from my ID, meaning he could find anything about me. I didn't sleep that night. I prayed that he hadn't discovered my host family's address. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages from Sebastian asking where I had gone and why I left, and whether I'd gone through his phone. I sent him one final message telling him that if he ever tried to contact me again, I'd call the police. Then I blocked him on every platform for the next few days. I lived in perpetual fear, worrying that he might show up at any moment. I locked down my Instagram, tightened all my security settings, and created a close friends list for outings, just in case he tried to track me down again. Thankfully, he hasn't shown up yet, and it's been about 3 months since I last heard from him. Still, I can't shake the pit in my stomach knowing he has my host family's address and might be planning something. I hope I never see him again, but I'll update this story if anything else happens. This happened a few years ago. I've always dreamed of living in Europe ever since I was a kid. It was my lifelong ambition. More than anything, though, I wanted to work with children because I've always had a natural rapport with them, and I knew I wouldn't feel complete unless my job involved caring for or teaching kids. So when I discovered I could become an au pair in France, where I could use the French I learned in high school and be part of a family, it felt like everything was falling into place. The decision wasn't easy. I'm from Canada, and the move was enormous, but France offered favorable visa options for Canadians, making it the perfect chance to improve my French, Canada's second language. Plus, I had a few friends in Paris, so I wouldn't feel completely alone. Money, however, was an issue. I didn't have any family support, and that's personal, so I couldn't afford one of those expensive agencies. Instead, I used a free au pair website, which wasn't ideal but was all I could manage. That's how I connected with Leah. Leah's demeanor was warm and straightforward. She needed help with her 2 kids while her husband traveled for work. She seemed wonderful, very polite and friendly on our video calls. She was quick to call me Sherry and male, which felt different from home but charmingly maternal. She asked many questions about me, how I interacted with kids, how I felt about family life, but didn't reveal much about herself. Still, she felt genuine, and I trusted her. The only thing that felt off was the kids. I'd asked to see them on our video calls more than once, but Leah always had a reason why they couldn't join. One was at school, the other was at a playdate. She promised I'd meet them as soon as I arrived, and although it felt a bit strange, I figured I'd see them soon enough. Leah then sent me a formal agreement. Everything looked proper, and we agreed on my start date. I booked my flight, packed my life into a suitcase, and said goodbye to Canada. When I landed at Charles de Gaulle, I was surprised that Leah wasn't there to greet me as most host families do at the airport. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Leah saying she was stuck in traffic and instructing me to go to the side drop-off area where she'd have someone pick me up. I remember using Google Translate on her message because it sounded as if someone else was coming for me, and I wanted to be sure I understood correctly. That left me confused and a little unsettled, but I followed her instructions. A few minutes later, a car pulled up, and a woman in her late 40s, perhaps with short blonde hair and a bright smile, approached me. She looked nothing like Leah and introduced herself as Leah's cousin, saying, "You must be Leah's au pair, she sent me to pick you up." I hesitated, something felt off immediately, and asked if I could speak to Leah. I unlocked my phone, but she brushed off my request, assuring me that Leah was probably still driving and would be waiting for me at home. I called Leah anyway, but the call went straight to voicemail. Despite this, the woman kept assuring me with a huge smile that I'd be fine. I was confused and exhausted from the flight, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to stand there forever waiting. So I got into the car. During the drive, the woman kept up a non-stop conversation, asking about my flight, my life in Canada, and if I was excited to start my new job. When I tried steering the conversation back to Leah or the children, she quickly brushed it off, saying that I'd love them and that I'd see them soon. Gradually, I started feeling more uneasy. The more she talked, the more I sensed something was amiss. The scenery outside began to change. I checked Google Maps, and the route didn't match my expected path. We were heading away from the suburbs into what looked like an industrial area. I started panicking and felt like I was being abducted. I asked her directly where we were going, and she replied lightly, calling it just a shortcut, and repeated that Leah was expecting us. My blood drained from my face. I knew then that she was lying. I told her to take me back to the airport, but she didn't respond. I threatened to call the police if she didn't turn around, and although she told me to relax, I wasn't backing down. When the car finally slowed down, I kicked the door open and jumped onto the street. The woman didn't drive off immediately. She simply looked at me as if I were the crazy one. I called my mom, who instructed me to get away from the car, find somewhere safe, and call for help. While I was on the phone with her, I looked through the windshield and noticed the woman speaking rapidly on her phone in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't French or English. I couldn't shake the gut feeling that she was pretending to be Leah. There wasn't another car in sight, but under no circumstances was I getting back in that vehicle. Eventually, the driver's side door opened, and the woman stepped toward me. I screamed that I was on the phone with the police, which made her stop without another word. She went back to the car, tossed my suitcase onto the road, and sped off. I managed to catch her license plate, though I was near tears while still on the phone with my mom. I ended up hitchhiking to a friend's house. I honestly don't know what I would have done without that option. My friend's family helped me file a report with the police and later even assisted me in catching a flight back to Canada, for which I was immensely grateful. Eventually, they updated me that the police had found no registered au pair family under Leah's name, the number she used was prepaid and untraceable, and all the photos of the children were taken from the internet. Everyone I spoke with about it told me the same thing. I was moments away from being trafficked. The worst part was that I wasted all that money on the plane tickets and traumatized myself permanently. Looking back, I know how lucky I am. I escaped from something truly horrible, something I can barely bring myself to imagine. It was all calculated from start to finish, and if I hadn't trusted my gut, I might not be here to tell the tale. It took some time, but I eventually made my way back to France, this time through a verified agency. I'm now hoping to eventually fulfill residency requirements and become a permanent citizen here.